We're back. This is Renovate and Build with Jim and Sandra, powered by Fair Trade Works.
Good morning. You're listening to Renovate and Build on this great Saturday morning, a show dedicated to all things construction.
Yes, good morning. Jim's so excited to interview our next guest. His name is Marcus Moose, and he's a professor in the planning department at the University of Waterloo, and he's truly helping us build our cities. He's here to talk about planning for the future and the future needs of millennials in our cities. Welcome to the show, Professor Moose.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Good morning, Professor. Why are the millennials so important in deciding the future of our cities?
They're at least part of the story of the generations that are, defining the future of our cities. Partly they're important because they're a large generation in size. So depending on how you define them, and there's some questions around how you do that, but generally they're about as the same size as the baby boom generation, or even a little bit larger depending on where you draw that boundary. So, their housing demand and their location preferences are going to shape the future of our cities for sure, just given their size. They're also important because they've been portraying these preferences in their residential location decisions for central locations, inner cities, near transit, near amenities. So they're raising questions about whether we're seeing a new kind of pattern where people are less likely to move sort of to the far-flung suburbs.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about what your research has proven for their needs, because they really are a unique thinking. I mean, they've been exposed to a lot more than, for instance, my generation.
Yeah, that's sort of the interesting thing about studying generational change and how it, connects to societal change. So generations change society because they have been exposed to different kinds of things over time. And now this generation, that's just millennials that are entering housing and labor markets now. They've grown up in cities that generally have had more rapid transit, more condominiums, more high-rise apartments. They're more used to living in large metropolitan areas. Many of them, granted, though, have grown up in the suburbs, but they're encountering higher housing prices. But they've also, are making decisions in a context where there's been a bit of a cultural change, right? So living in inner cities near amenities, close to where the action is now trendy, right, and has been for some time now. So there's a bit of a shift as to where people want to live. Young people are definitely saying, I don't want to remove myself from where things are happening. I want to be right in the middle of it, and I want to be able to walk to the coffee shop and to my friend's house. Now,
for your research, are you saying 1980 to early 2000s? Is that what you're using for the definition of millennials?
Yeah, so millennials, sort of 1981 to 1999, actually,
Okay.
And I within that I sometimes use a definition of young adults that are that are about 25 to 34 years old, and I distinguish between millennials and just the more general definition of young adults, because when we're thinking about housing and location decisions, it makes more sense to look at people in their mid-20s onward, because when they're in their early 20s, just the way society has changed, so many millennials are still in post-secondary education. So their location's very much dictated by where they're going to school.
And I guess their exposure even to technology has opened up. They're way more global in their thinking than many of the earlier generations.
Yeah, I haven't really, explicitly studied that myself, but certainly in the literature I've come across around, these notions of technology and the way it influences people's perception and views. Certainly, the argument is that millennials are better connected. They're communicating in new kinds of ways, and one of the things I've come across that relates to this in my area of research is this desire to be connected and communicating at all times, and this has in some ways shifted. An argument has been made that it's shifted transportation demand towards public transit. It's hard to walk and text, even though a lot of people try it. It's even more difficult to cycle and text, and it's illegal to drive and text, but you can, of course, sit on the bus quite comfortably and text or work on your laptop. So there's sort of there's an incentive when you're wanting to be on social media to using public transit.
Yes, it's interesting listening to that. Like, how difficult is it for older generations not to assume what they believe that planning should involve?
Right. Yeah. It's difficult sometimes for one to step outside your own generational frame and see how things have changed. And so, if we're thinking about how to plan cities, we have to do so from the perception of people who we're building it for. So it's important to, of course, to consult millennials and find out, well, what is it that they desire in city building. And I think one of the things that's just changed dramatically is that when some of the baby boomers were first making their housing choices, downtowns are very different, right? They're not as developed. There wasn't as much residential land use in the downtowns. It was much more still industry and employment uses at that point. Of course, some of the baby boomers were some of the first to move into the inner cities, starting in the 60s and 70s as sort of a countercultural trend, but then many of them later moved to the suburbs. But millennials now, they're moving similarly into cities, but in bigger numbers. And the question is, will they stay? And that's, of course, still an unanswered question because we haven't quite gotten there as we're having to wait to see them age still.
It's so interesting, yeah. I know you're out in Vancouver speaking often, but what do you find is important? Some of the important aspects of planning for a city like Vancouver?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in Vancouver you have sort of a unique challenge in terms of ensuring that young people will continue to be able, or young people even as they age, the millennials, will continue to be able to access transit supportive and walkable locations, because that seems to be what they're desiring. And I say that so as household size grows, as millennials are delaying in many ways having children and moving in with partners, but when they are, the difficulty that we're observing is that it becomes more difficult to live in those central locations just because of the high cost of apartments or townhouses that are larger in size. As a single millennial, you can maybe afford to rent or even buy a one-bedroom condo or a studio. But if you're then adding 2-3 bedrooms to have a couple of kids in there as well, it exceeds the prices. Then exceed the sort of ability of most millennials to afford it. And so if part of the planning objective is in Metro Vancouver, and the planning documents would suggest it is to stem sprawl and build compact communities where people have different transportation modes available to them, then we also have to ensure that there's family-sized housing near transit. And I know the New Westminster just is addressing that issue to some extent.
Do you find that it's hard because there is that generational gap to get the information in and then apply it before those millennials are actually buying?
I mean, it's probably part of the issue, right? It's difficult to predict the future, so I'm not sure 20 years ago or 10 years ago we might have expected quite the influx of millennials into the central cities and expected that we should be planning for families in downtowns. But certainly also there's just the housing market pressure, so prices are very high, and for people to maintain prices at a level they can afford, what happened in part is that apartments just kept getting smaller and smaller, so that the total purchasing price either stayed similar or only increased slightly, but you're getting less and less space. I don't know if you've ever, if you go to a friend's house who have condos built in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then 2014, you'll notice that space gets smaller and smaller.
Dramatically.
Yeah, that's right. Even if they have the same number of bedrooms, right? So you're sort of, as the demand for Vancouver real estate increased, you got smaller spaces. Now, what that has also happened during that time is a removal of provincial and federal funding from housing programs, right, or a decrease at least. And so there are less programs to help with affordable housing, and more demand and more pressures on the housing markets. And so I think we're starting to see the sort of result of that is that we're seeing increases in affordability burdens across the population, but it's also impacting the young adults. I mean, in Vancouver from the 80s, where you had about 32% of young adults spending more than 30% of their income on shelter costs, that went to about 38% in 2006, and we'd have to look at more recent data to see what it is today, but certainly an increase over time. And in Vancouver, affordability is, concerns are among the largest in Canada.
Do you think we have a lot to learn from countries who've already gone through this, Europe, Asia, already looking at how people aren't going to be spending as much time in their homes, and they're going to be asking for more amenities outside, public spaces, facilities within their buildings where they can actually kind of get out. So basically sleep inside and eat inside, but be able to share more as a community?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that that's sort of the key change that might have to happen is that people assume you're giving up private space for nothing, right? When you're moving from a single-family home to a condo, but that's obviously not true, right? You're moving to a smaller private space, but you're also gaining a lot of public amenities. And so, in terms of the urban planning, if we're moving people into denser urban environments, yes, we very much have to learn how to plan for more shared public spaces, so that people don't feel like they don't have, maintain a quality of life where they're able to access green spaces, waterfronts, and coffee shops, public squares, those kinds of things that make a city livable. And arguably, Vancouver's has been quite proactive on that front and has many beautiful and quite heavily used public spaces. So Vancouver, I think, is well on its way to having this sort of public infrastructure that supports smaller private spaces.
It's interesting. So, Professor, what do you believe is the best forum to collect, further information?
Further information about the millennials' housing changes?
Yeah, just about what's happening and what you're studying, and just kind of what's the next step to kind of collect data that's true so we can really plan for this kind of next shift.
Right, yeah. So at the moment, actually, I'm designing a survey for millennials, the housing challenges that they're facing, and the kind of decisions that led them to the location and housing choices that they've made, to better understand some of the factors behind their decisions. So now, we've used large-scale data sets to figure out, well, what kind of housing are they moving in, what kind of neighborhoods are they moving in. Now we want to get sort of more at the subjective side of it, or not subjective, sort of qualitative side of it, and figure out a bit more about what are the motivations behind millennials' behaviors. And that will really help us understand is the move to smaller apartments near transit, is it purely an affordability move? Probably not. It's probably somewhat affordability, probably somewhat housing preferences, right, and other factors. But we want to sort of be able to tease that out. The second piece of it is we will continue to need large-scale data sets to tell us how these kind of population demographic changes are occurring at the neighborhood level. And the sad news there is that because of we have lost the long-form census through changes that happened with Statistics Canada and the move to the National Household Survey, we no longer have the representative data at this neighborhood scale that I used to do some of this research with the last census, which was 2006, and then the 2011 moved to the National Household Survey. So unfortunately, some of this research we won't be able to do in the same way due to some of those changes that have happened.
Well, your research is fascinating, and obviously at the University of Waterloo you've got a prime demographic there to learn about the millennials as well. We hope the next time you're out in Vancouver you'll join us and share your further updates on your research.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Thank you very much for joining us on Renovate and Build. We've been speaking with Professor Marcus Moos from the University of Waterloo Planning Department. And
that's all we have time for today. This hour has flown by as usual.
And we do have an exciting week next week ahead. I hope you have time to recharge. Next Saturday, we'll be here on Renovate and Build with all kinds of new experts.
And we encourage you to drop us a line if you'd like to have your construction-related questions answered on air.
Or if you'd even like to comment on the show today and what you've heard, please email us at radio@fairtradeworks.biz.
And as always, a big thank you to Dwayne, our producer, and the rest of the crew here at CL650 for the help each week in putting this great production together. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful weekend.
Coming up next, Tom Lucas and Sherry Brown with Radio Real Estate. See you next Saturday.
Introducing a revolutionary new construction system. This is Renovate and Build with Jim and Sandra.